My name is Adelia Smith, and I am 57 years old. 2 years ago, on the night of my 55th birthday, my husband handed me divorce papers and told me my best friend of 20 years was moving into our home by Friday. They took the property, they drained the accounts, and they left me with nothing but a cramped apartment and the clothes on my back. For 2 years, I stayed quiet. I worked in the shadows. Then yesterday morning, my ex-husband walked into a coffee shop in downtown Mobile, Alabama, and dropped his cup on the floor. Because staring back at him from the cover of Forbes magazine was the woman he claimed was too simple to understand business. His hands were shaking when he called me. I let it ring and smiled because he did not know the worst part yet. Before we get into how I dismantled his entire empire, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your age in the comments. I want to know what season of life you are in right now. Now let me take you back to a muggy August evening in 2022, to the sweeping veranda of a 19th century home and the most expensive birthday gift I ever received. The air in Mobile always felt heavier in late summer. It pressed down like a damp wool blanket. On the veranda, the humidity seemed to amplify the scent of blooming magnolias and the sharp clink of ice against crystal. I traced the rim of my sweet tea glass, watching a solitary bead of condensation slip down the side and soak into the linen coaster. I was the consummate Southern hostess, a role I wore as effortlessly as my tailored silk blouse. Laughter drifted from the dining room, where the remnants of a roasted pecan tart sat on fine china. Richard stood by the French doors, nursing a bourbon. His linen suit was crisp despite the stifling heat. He was a man who commanded logistics fleets across the Southeast, accustomed to directing the flow of goods with a wave of his hand. Yet tonight, his eyes darted away whenever I looked in his direction. The screen door whined open. Valerie stepped onto the veranda. Her heels clicked a sharp rhythmic tempo against the painted floorboards. We had been friends for 2 decades, sharing hushed secrets over endless pots of coffee while Richard built his wealth. Valerie carried a small, heavy box wrapped in silver paper. "For the birthday girl," she said. Her voice was bright, pitched perhaps a fraction too loud. I took the package. I pulled away the ribbon and lifted the lid to reveal a velvet interior. Resting inside was a vintage Cartier tank watch, its gold face gleaming under the amber porch light. A guest called from the doorway, telling Valerie she was far too generous. I stared at the watch, the leather strap, the distinct Roman numerals. A quiet hum started at the base of my skull. I did not merely manage the household. For years, I had been the silent architect of Richard's payroll, the one who caught the discrepancies his high-priced accountants missed. My mind pulled up a ledger entry from 7 days prior. A charge on Richard's corporate credit card, $14,250. At the time, Richard had muttered an excuse about a client gift for a retiring regional director. I lifted my chin. I looked at Valerie's flushed cheeks, noting the triumphant glint in her eyes, poorly disguised as generosity. Then I looked at Richard. He was staring intensely at the ice in his glass. His jaw was locked tight. The geometry of the betrayal materialized in an instant. It was not a fleeting suspicion. It was a mathematical certainty. The Cartier watch was an anchor dragging the truth to the surface, right there on the veranda. I did not drop the box. I did not raise my voice. I smiled, a measured, polite curving of the lips, and snapped the velvet lid shut. "It is unforgettable, Valerie," I said. "Thank you." 2 hours later, the gravel driveway emptied. The taillights of the last car faded into the thick southern night. I stood in the foyer, extinguishing the hallway lamps one by one. The house settled into a profound quiet. Richard walked out of his study. He did not hold a birthday card. He held a standard manila folder. He stopped a few feet away, keeping the antique console table between us as a barricade. He placed the folder on the polished wood. The document inside was thick and edged with the stiff blue backing of legal stationery. "I am not going to draw this out, Adelia," Richard said. His voice lacked the practiced warmth he reserved for his clients. It was strictly transactional. I am filing for divorce. I looked down at the folder and then back to the man I had built a life alongside. Valerie is moving in on Friday, he continued. He pushed the words out quickly, eager to dispense with the unpleasantness. I have arranged for a temporary apartment for you downtown. The lease is paid for 6 months. It is generous, considering. He waited for the tears. He braced for the accusations, the breaking of vases, the hysterical collapse he had likely rehearsed handling. I offered him nothing. My upbringing had drilled one ironclad rule into my spine: never bleed in front of a shark. I rested my hand on the manila folder, feeling the weight of the paper. I did not open it. Friday, I repeated. My tone was flat and revealed zero emotion. Yes, Richard blinked. He was thrown off balance by the sudden chill in the room. I see, I said. I picked up the folder, turned, and walked toward the sweeping mahogany staircase. I did not look back. The war had begun, and Richard had just handed me the first weapon. The morning sun hit the pavement with a blinding glare, baking the overnight dew into a thick mist. I drove downtown, the tires of my sedan humming over the brick-paved streets of the historic district. I had not slept. I had spent the night sitting in a wingback chair in the parlor, watching the shadows stretch across the crown molding. The manila folder rested exactly where Richard had left it, on the console table. At 9 o'clock sharp, I carried it into the law offices of Thomas Gable, an attorney who had handled my family estate for 3 decades. His office smelled of lemon polish and old binding glue. Thomas took the folder from my hands, adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and began to read. I expected him to draft a standard response: a division of property, a negotiation over the investment portfolios, the usual bitter arithmetic of a severed marriage. Instead, Thomas stopped on the 3rd page, his brow furrowed, deepening the lines carved into his forehead. He read it again. Then he looked up at me, taking off his glasses with a slow, deliberate motion that sent a fresh wave of cold down my spine. The second layer of Richard's betrayal was not about replacing me. It was about financial erasure. Thomas slid the document across the polished mahogany desk, tapping a manicured finger on a specific paragraph. He asked me if I remembered the paperwork I signed last December. The memories surfaced instantly. It was a week before Christmas. Richard had come home smelling of stale coffee and panic, pacing the length of the study. He told me his logistics firm was facing a ruinous liability lawsuit from a multi-vehicle accident in Georgia. He painted a picture of ruthless plaintiffs aiming for our personal wealth. To shield our assets, he brought home a stack of legal documents drawn up by a corporate litigator. He told me we needed to transfer the deed to our 19th century home and the entirety of our joint savings into a specialized, irrevocable trust. I had signed on the dotted lines without reading the fine print, trusting the man who slept beside me. Thomas folded his hands over the desk and delivered the fatal blow. The lawsuit was a fabrication. There was no liability case in Georgia. The trust, however, was very real. Richard had structured it so that he retained sole executive control over the disbursements. Worse, the primary beneficiary listed in the event of a marital dissolution was not me. It was an entity controlled by Valerie. They had been planning this execution for half a year, smiling at me over holiday dinners, while quietly pulling the floorboards out from under my feet. I asked Thomas how we break the trust. I wanted injunctions, asset freezes, whatever legal mechanism existed to claw back my life. Thomas sighed, the sound heavy with professional defeat. He explained that fighting an irrevocable trust of this complexity requires proving deliberate fraud at the time of signing. Richard had used top-tier corporate attorneys to bury the clauses in layers of legal jargon. Thomas told me a court battle would take a minimum of 5 years. It would require hundreds of thousands of dollars in retainer fees, dollars I no longer possessed because Richard had neatly siphoned our liquidity into the offshore accounts shielded by the trust. If I fought him in family court, he would bleed me dry through endless litigation until I could not afford to keep the lights on in the cheap apartment he had rented for me. I left the law office and drove back to the house. The air conditioning inside hummed a steady, quiet tune. I stood in the grand hallway. The mahogany grandfather clock near the staircase ticked with a heavy, metronomic rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Each swing of the brass pendulum felt like a countdown. My phone vibrated in my purse. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. I swiped the screen and held the speaker to my ear, saying nothing. "I assume you spoke with your lawyer," Richard said. His voice echoed slightly, likely calling from his spacious corner office overlooking the shipping yards. He did not sound angry. He sounded insulated. The tone dripped with an arrogant pity, the kind of voice one uses to explain a harsh reality to a naive child. "I told you I did not want to draw this out, Adelia. The paperwork is ironclad. My corporate team made sure of it. You have 30 days to vacate the property. The new deed requires the premises to be turned over by the end of the month." I listened to the pendulum swing. I pictured Valerie picking out new drapes for the master bedroom. I pictured Richard sitting at his desk, confident he had cornered a helpless housewife. He expected me to beg. He expected me to negotiate for scraps, perhaps ask for a small stipend, or plead for a few more months in the home my grandparents had restored. Southern women are often taught that grace means suffering quietly. But grace without teeth is just submission. I took a slow breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. "I will be out by the 30th, Richard," I said. My voice was smooth, betraying zero panic. I ended the call before he could formulate a response. I did not weep. I did not throw the antique vases against the plaster walls. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, breaking the stillness. I walked past my packed suitcases, bypassed the parlor, and stepped into Richard's home study. I sat in his leather chair and powered on the desktop computer. Richard operated under a fatal misconception. He believed that because his name was on the building, he understood how the machinery functioned. But for 2 decades, I was the one who balanced the ledgers late at night. I was the one who processed the payroll files, negotiated the vendor contracts when he was too busy golfing with clients, and mapped the supply chain routes during his startup years. I knew his business infrastructure better than his own chief financial officer. I knew the vendors he neglected, the tax loopholes he abused, and the technological blind spots he ignored. I opened a secure browser window and began digging through the digital archives I had secretly backed up to a private cloud server months ago, long before the trust was ever signed. I always kept a backup. It was an old habit born from the early days of keeping the company afloat. Now that habit was my only lifeline. The conflict had shifted. This was no longer a battle for a house or a savings account. It was a siege. I needed to find a structural weakness in his logistics empire. I scrolled through pages of vendor payouts, equipment leases, and software licensing agreements. The numbers blurred and sharpened on the screen as the afternoon sun crept across the Persian rug. I was looking for the one thread that, if pulled hard enough, would unravel his entire operation. And right there, buried in a folder of operational expenditures, I found a recurring digital footprint. A glaring technological vulnerability within his routing software that made my pulse steady into a cold, relentless rhythm. I printed the documents, folded them into my purse, and closed the laptop. The mourning period was over. The strategy phase had begun. Sunday mornings in Mobile were a coordinated performance of seersucker suits, linen dresses, and perfectly timed smiles. I attended the 10 o'clock service at the historic Presbyterian Church downtown, maintaining the routine I had established over 2 decades. The humidity clung to the stained glass windows, softening the morning light as it filtered onto the polished oak pews. The sanctuary was crowded, the air heavy with the scent of hairspray and old paper hymnals. I sat in my usual spot near the center aisle, wearing a tailored navy dress, my posture perfectly aligned. A shift in the atmosphere occurred before the prelude began. I felt the subtle turn of heads, the slight adjustment of posture from the congregation around me. Valerie walked down the side aisle. She was not alone. She walked beside Richard, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. She wore a pale yellow dress that caught the light, looking radiant and appropriately solemn. They slid into a pew 3 rows ahead of me, deliberately placing themselves in my direct line of sight. The third layer of conflict was not financial. It was social warfare, waged with polite smiles and hushed tones. As the congregation stood for the opening hymn, I watched Valerie lean over to whisper to Eleanor Vance, a woman whose primary occupation was distributing the town's most potent rumors. Eleanor nodded slowly, casting a glance back at me that was thick with fabricated pity. The Southern social circuit operates on an unspoken currency of reputation, and Valerie was actively liquidating mine. After the service, the congregation spilled onto the manicured lawn. The heat was immediate, prompting the synchronized flutter of handheld fans. I walked toward my car, navigating the groups of congregants chatting under the shade of the ancient oak trees. Valerie intercepted me near the wrought iron gates. She held a Bible clutched to her chest, her expression arranged into a mask of deep concern. "Adelia," she said, her voice pitched perfectly to reach the ears of the surrounding women, "we have all been praying for you." I stopped, turning to face her. Several women nearby halted their conversations, pretending to adjust their hats while straining to listen. Richard stood a few paces behind Valerie, his expression tight, looking anywhere but at me. Valerie placed a manicured hand on her chest. "It breaks my heart to see you struggling with all of this, but you have to understand, Richard is under so much pressure. The logistics industry is changing so fast. He just needed a partner who understands the demands of modern business, someone who can help carry the strategic load." The insult was perfectly executed. It was designed to paint me as an obsolete relic, a simple housewife who had failed to keep pace with her successful husband. The women around us exchanged significant looks. Then came the ultimate Southern dismissal, whispered by someone behind me, floating through the humid air. Bless her heart. The phrase is never a blessing. It is a polite execution. It means the recipient is too slow, too naive, or too pathetic to realize their own misfortune. They were burying me under a mound of fake sympathy. I looked at Valerie, noting the slight tremor of anticipation in her hands. She wanted a scene. She wanted me to raise my voice, to justify her narrative that I was unstable and incapable of handling the transition. I offered her a serene, unbothered smile. "Thank you for your prayers, Valerie," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any defensiveness. "I am sure they will be heard exactly where they belong." I turned and walked to my car, leaving her standing on the sidewalk. I understood then that fighting in the gossip circles was a losing battle. Valerie controlled the narrative because Richard controlled the checkbook that funded the church renovations and the local charity galas. To win this war, I could not fight them in the light. I had to disappear. That afternoon, I drove to a private jeweler in a neighboring county. I carried a velvet pouch containing pieces of my history. My grandmother's platinum engagement ring, a diamond tennis bracelet Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary, a pair of sapphire earrings I had worn to my own wedding rehearsal. The jeweler, a discreet man who asked no questions, assessed the stones under a loupe and transferred a significant sum into my newly opened, independent checking account. It was not enough to fight a trust fund in court, but it was enough to fund a siege. By Tuesday, I had vacated the historic home. I moved into the apartment Richard had leased for me on the edge of the industrial district. The contrast was severe. The space smelled of old cooking oil and industrial cleaner. The floors were covered in a cheap, peeling linoleum that squeaked under my shoes, a sharp auditory reminder of the hardwood floors I had polished for years. The walls were thin, vibrating with the rumble of freight trains passing on the nearby tracks. I unpacked a single suitcase containing my clothes and the manila folder with the printed digital footprints from Richard's computer. I set up my laptop on a wobbly Formica table in the tiny kitchen. The noise of the city pressed against the single-pane window, but inside my mind, there was only a cold, sharp focus. I was not retreating. I was going underground. I spent 3 days tracing the vulnerability I had found in Richard's routing software. The algorithm his fleet relied on was built 10 years ago, held together by digital duct tape and inefficient code. It was bleeding his company dry in fuel costs and delayed delivery times, but Richard was too arrogant to invest in a costly system overhaul. I needed to find the person who had written the original code. My search led me to an address on the outskirts of town near the abandoned shipyards. I drove my sedan through a rundown industrial park, past rusted chain-link fences and warehouses with blown-out windows. I parked in front of a corrugated metal building that looked more like a storage unit than an office. I knocked on the heavy steel door. A moment later, it swung open. The man standing there was in his late 30s, wearing a faded band t-shirt and dark-rimmed glasses. His name was Elias Thorne. 10 years ago, he had been a brilliant, eccentric developer hired by Richard to build the company's first digital infrastructure. Richard had fired him 2 years later over a dispute regarding software licensing rights, claiming Elias was too difficult to manage. Elias squinted at me through the harsh afternoon sunlight. "Mrs. Smith," he said, sounding surprised but not unwelcoming. "Adelia," I corrected him. "I need 5 minutes of your time, Elias." He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The inside of the unit was chaotic, filled with server racks humming loudly and multiple monitors displaying lines of code. It smelled of ozone and stale coffee. Elias cleared a stack of circuit boards off a folding chair and offered it to me. I did not sit. I pulled the printed documents from my purse and placed them on a desk next to his keyboard. I told him I knew his original algorithm was still running Richard's entire fleet. I told him I knew the system was failing under the weight of current market demands. And then I told him I also knew he had spent the last 5 years developing a superior, patented integration tool that could fix those exact failures, but he lacked the capital to bring it to market. Elias looked at the papers, his posture stiffening. "How do you know about my patent?" "Because I know how to read the filings Richard's corporate lawyers missed," I said. "Richard needs your tech to survive the upcoming fiscal year, but he is too stubborn to admit he needs the man he fired." Elias leaned back, crossing his arms. "And what does that have to do with you? I heard you were out of the picture." "I am," I replied, my voice steady over the hum of the servers. "That is exactly why I am here. I am offering to buy a controlling stake in your startup. I have the capital you need to launch, and I have the precise operational knowledge of Richard's supply chain to integrate your software perfectly." Elias let out a short, cynical laugh. "You want to help Richard? After what he did?" I looked directly into his eyes, letting the cold determination I had cultivated over the past week strip away any illusion of a polite Southern housewife. "I do not want to help him, Elias. I want to own the toll booth he has to drive through." Elias stared at me for a long moment, the cynicism fading from his expression, replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. The grind had begun. The vibrations of the midnight freight trains became my metronome. Sitting at the wobbly Formica table in my cramped kitchen, I stared at the harsh blue light of my laptop screen until my eyes burned. The Alabama summer heat pressed against the thin glass window, offering zero relief. For 3 weeks, I operated on minimal sleep. I lived on bitter black coffee and a cold determination that pushed physical exhaustion to the periphery. The walls of the apartment were paper thin, offering a nightly symphony of arguing neighbors and wailing sirens. It was a jarring departure from the secluded, manicured silence of the historic district I had called home. Yet the discomfort sharpened my focus. My singular task was to dissect Richard's logistics network piece by piece. During the early years of our marriage, before the corner offices and the country club memberships, I was the one who balanced his fuel receipts by hand. I mapped the delivery routes across the Southeast using neon highlighters and folded paper maps spread across our old dining table. I understood the granular reality of moving freight. Richard only understood the overarching profit margins. That fundamental disconnect was his Achilles heel. I analyzed the shifting market data alongside the digital footprints I had secured from his home study. The vulnerability was glaring. His operational routing algorithm was an archaic dinosaur. In an industry where profit is measured in fractions of minutes and gallons, his trucks were hemorrhaging fuel. They idled in unpredictable traffic jams his software could not forecast. They drove empty miles on return trips his system failed to optimize. The inefficiency was costing his firm millions, and the shifting economy was tightening those margins. He was bleeding time and money, but his towering ego blinded him to the structural decay beneath his feet. I brought these findings back to the corrugated metal warehouse on the edge of the abandoned shipyards. Elias Thorne sat behind his barricade of humming servers and towers of empty energy drink cans. Elias was a genuine visionary with code, but a sheer disaster with commerce. He had spent 5 years perfecting a dynamic predictive integration tool. His software could reroute a fleet in real time, calculating weather patterns, traffic density, and payload capacities instantly. He held the golden patent. Yet his startup was suffocating because he lacked the corporate polish required to sell a product to skeptical boardrooms. We struck a bargain amidst the ozone smell of overheating electronics. I did not want to build a sprawling tech empire from scratch. I needed a surgical weapon. Using the funds generated from liquidating my grandmother's platinum jewelry and the remnants of my hidden personal savings, I purchased a controlling 60% stake in his dying venture. Elias retained 40% and the title of lead developer. He agreed with surprising eagerness. Half of a highly functional business was far superior to full ownership of a bankrupt idea. Elias watched me sign the preliminary contracts, his dark-rimmed glasses reflecting the glow of his monitors. He asked me why a woman who spent the last 20 years hosting charity galas knew so much about supply chain optimization. I told him the galas were just a performance. The real work always happened in the shadows, while everyone else was distracted by the champagne. He nodded, recognizing a shared fluency in unseen labor. I took our partnership agreement to an independent corporate attorney located hours away in Birmingham, avoiding anyone in Mobile who might recognize my face or my name. The lawyer asked no questions regarding my motives, perfectly content to process the required retainer fee. We structured the new holding company behind an impenetrable labyrinth of legal protections. The entity was placed into an ironclad blind trust. By utilizing a registered agent in Delaware, any audit or background check initiated by Richard's corporate hounds would hit a solid brick wall of privacy statutes. On paper, the owner was a faceless corporate proxy. I named the new firm Aegis Systems. An aegis represents a mythical shield, but mine was forged strictly for offense. The transition from discarded wife to corporate architect happened quietly in the margins of signed legal filings. The fourth conflict was firmly established. I was no longer fighting for my rightful share of the past. I was engineering a strict monopoly over his future. Richard required a technological miracle to survive the upcoming fiscal year. He needed a sophisticated bridge to cross the widening gap between his outdated fleet and modern market demands. I owned the exclusive blueprints to that bridge. Offering the solution directly, however, would trigger his suspicion instantly. Richard despised unsolicited advice, and he abhorred spending capital on upgrades unless he firmly believed the initiative was his own brilliant concept. I had to manipulate his internal hierarchy. I had to make his executives beg for my product. My primary target was not Richard. My target was Marcus Lynn. Marcus served as the chief director of information technology for Richard's logistics firm. I remembered Marcus vividly. 10 years prior, I had strongly advocated for his hiring when Richard argued the young man lacked sufficient gray hair for the role. Marcus was sharp, driven, and chronically stressed. I knew Richard was currently berating him in weekly board meetings, demanding a miraculous solution to the fuel hemorrhaging without offering an adequate development budget. Working alongside Elias, I crafted a hyper-targeted promotional package. We did not send a generic marketing brochure. We compiled a bespoke data simulation using Richard's actual route metrics, disguised cleverly as an anonymous industry case study. The simulation demonstrated exactly how the Aegis Systems integration tool would cut operational waste by 22% within the first 90 days. It highlighted the exact logistical pain points Marcus was sweating over every single day. It was an irresistible lifeline thrown directly to a drowning man. I packaged the encrypted flash drive inside a sleek, matte black box bearing the silver Aegis logo. The presentation was flawless and engineered to communicate high-tier exclusivity. I drove to a postal facility 2 towns over and mailed the package via priority courier directly to Marcus's private office suite. I walked out into the sweltering Alabama sun, feeling the concrete radiate heat through the soles of my shoes. The promotional package would land on Marcus's mahogany desk by Tuesday morning. He would plug the drive into his terminal. He would run the simulation. He would realize it was the exact salvation his boss demanded to keep the company afloat. He would polish the presentation and pitch it to Richard as his own groundbreaking discovery. The trap was armed, and the bait was irresistible. I owned the only toll booth on the highway, and my ex-husband was speeding directly toward the gate. 18 months dissolved into the humid Alabama atmosphere. The passage of time manifested differently for the residents of Mobile. Up on the hill, beneath the ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, my former residence hummed with the superficial vibrancy of a southern social season. Valerie hosted elaborate garden parties beneath strings of warm, incandescent lights. I knew this because the local society pages documented every catered affair. She wore silk designer gowns and posed holding crystal champagne flutes, cementing her status among the elite circles that had so easily discarded me. Yet photographs cannot conceal the microscopic fractures in a man's posture. In those glossy magazine spreads, Richard always stood near the edge of the frame. His tailored suits hung slightly looser on his shoulders. The smile he offered the camera never reached the corners of his eyes. The logistics industry was punishing his lack of foresight. Regional fuel prices surged, competitor transit times dropped, and his archaic dispatch system was bleeding revenue faster than he could patch the holes. He was presiding over a sinking ship while his new partner demanded more expensive deck chairs. Richard had inherited a comfortable foundation from his father, a man who built the fleet with a single flatbed truck. But Richard lacked the grit required to navigate a technological revolution. My reality existed in a sterile, windowless office space we rented above a defunct auto parts store on the outskirts of Birmingham. I stripped away every luxury, adopting a monastic routine governed strictly by market analysis and code deployment. The squeaking linoleum of my first apartment was replaced by the low, constant thrum of Elias running server diagnostics. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I sat alone at my desk. The glow of 3 oversized monitors painted my face in harsh blue light. I ate cold sesame noodles straight from a cardboard takeout container, my eyes scanning strings of encrypted data. The exhaustion was a heavy physical weight pressing down on my spine, but the momentum of Aegis Systems propelled me forward. We were not merely building software. We were constructing an inescapable labyrinth. My grandfather used to say that the most dangerous hunter is the one who learns to sit perfectly still. I had spent a year and a half barely breathing. The trap I laid inside Richard's corporate hierarchy performed exactly as anticipated. Marcus Lynn, the IT director I had carefully targeted with the anonymous promotional package, became my unwitting champion. Faced with Richard's escalating demands for operational miracles, Marcus presented the Aegis simulation during a quarterly executive board meeting. My proxy informants confirmed the details of the presentation. Marcus projected our bespoke metrics onto the boardroom wall, demonstrating a potential 22% reduction in overhead waste. Richard, desperate to halt the fiscal hemorrhage, approved the initiative without hesitation. He even went as far as claiming he had directed Marcus toward predictive integration months prior, neatly absorbing the credit to save face in front of his shareholders. The procurement phase was a delicate, high-stakes negotiation. Richard's corporate lawyers demanded endless meetings to vet the new vendor. I remained a phantom throughout the entire process. Elias operated as the public face of the company, adopting the persona of a brilliant but socially aloof tech founder. When Richard's legal team requested the identity of the primary shareholder, our Delaware registered agent provided the name of an opaque holding corporation. Richard was too preoccupied with his plummeting quarterly projections to investigate the corporate shell game. He needed the integration tool operational before the lucrative winter shipping rush, blinding him to the standard due diligence he would normally enforce. The finalized agreement was a staggering commitment. Richard signed a 7-year, multi-million-dollar licensing contract to implement our proprietary routing matrix across his entire fleet. He believed he was purchasing salvation. He failed to comprehend the architecture of the legal bindings I had personally authored and slipped into the labyrinthine terms of service. The contract was heavily front-loaded with strict financial covenants. It demanded uninterrupted monthly premium payments processed on the first day of each billing cycle. There was 0 grace period for late transfers. More importantly, Clause 47 contained a digital kill switch. The lawyers had pushed back on this detail, but Elias held firm, arguing it was a non-negotiable security standard for high-tier artificial intelligence to protect proprietary algorithms from insolvent clients. If Richard missed a payment deadline by a single hour, Aegis Systems retained the legal authority to remotely sever his network access. He would lose his GPS tracking, his automated dispatch schedules, and his predictive weather routing instantly. He signed his name in dark ink on the final page, binding his entire nervous system to a server I controlled. The implementation rollout was seamless. Elias wrote code that performed flawlessly under pressure. Within 30 days, Richard's fleet transformed from a sluggish beast into a highly efficient organism. Delivery times plummeted, fuel consumption stabilized, the corporate bleeding stopped. Richard's arrogance returned with frightening speed. He gave interviews to regional business journals, boasting about his visionary pivot toward digital infrastructure. He attributed the miraculous turnaround to his own steadfast leadership, entirely unaware that the woman he threw away was holding the reins of his entire operation. I monitored the results from my desk above the auto parts store. A digital map of the Southeast illuminated my center screen. Hundreds of tiny green dots crawled along the interstate highways, each one representing a commercial freight truck owned by Richard's firm. Every turn they made, every gallon of diesel they saved, flowed through my servers. I tracked their precise coordinates, calculating the exact dollar amount I was generating for the man who stole my home. The power dynamic had shifted silently in the dark. I possessed the ability to bring his empire to a grinding halt with a single keystroke. The software was doing its job, inflating his profits and feeding his hubris. But the illusion of stability is a dangerous narcotic. Valerie, emboldened by the sudden influx of revenue and eager to solidify her position in high society, accelerated her spending habits. She contracted a renowned architectural firm to renovate the historic property's carriage house into a private spa. She planned luxury vacations to the Mediterranean, demanding chartered flights. Richard indulged her, eager to maintain the facade of infinite wealth. He failed to realize that the Aegis software, while saving him operational costs, carried a steep monthly licensing fee. His cash flow was improving on paper, but his liquid capital was stretched dangerously thin across new corporate debts and Valerie's extravagant lifestyle. The margin for error had shrunk to practically zero. To sustain his empire and satisfy his partner's insatiable appetite for prestige, Richard would soon need a profound injection of outside capital. His traditional credit lines were maxed out. He would need to seek a specialized loan, opening a new door to a very specific kind of predator. The veneer of Southern perfection is notoriously fragile. It requires constant financial nourishment to prevent the underlying rot from seeping through the floorboards. Up in the historic district, my former husband was discovering the steep price of maintaining an illusion. The Aegis Systems integration tool was performing miracles on his dispatch floor, but the monthly licensing premium was a heavy iron anchor dragging his liquid cash reserves into the abyss. His operational metrics looked pristine on quarterly reports, yet his bank accounts were gasping for air. This invisible deficit created a toxic friction within the walls of my old home. Valerie had grown accustomed to a certain cadence of indulgence. Her grand plans for transforming the carriage house into a private wellness retreat hit a sudden concrete wall when the lead contractor requested the second installment of his exorbitant fee. Richard was forced to delay the wire transfer. The disruption offended Valerie deeply. She did not orchestrate the dismantling of my 25-year marriage to inherit a strict budget. She expected an endless fountain of capital. According to my network of lingering social contacts, the arguments began as hushed, tense exchanges in the foyer and quickly escalated into shouting matches that echoed across the manicured lawns. Valerie felt the sting of Richard tightening the purse strings and interpreted it as a personal insult rather than a symptom of corporate distress. To pacify her escalating demands, Richard needed a rapid injection of liquid capital. Traditional lending institutions were tightening their criteria for logistics operations, viewing the sector as a volatile risk due to shifting global trade routes. His local banking connections, those men he golfed with on Sunday afternoons, offered polite apologies and firm rejections. His desperation was a palpable scent drifting down from the hill directly into my waiting hands. While Richard scrambled for loose change, my reality was undergoing a seismic transformation. Aegis Systems had disrupted the regional supply chain market so effectively that we triggered the radar of a global tech conglomerate based out of Seattle. They did not want to compete with our proprietary algorithm. They wanted to devour it. The acquisition negotiations were swift and ruthless. Elias and I sat across from an army of corporate attorneys in a high-rise conference room, navigating a buyout offer that resembled the gross domestic product of a small island nation. I agreed to the sale under two unyielding conditions. First, my identity as the primary shareholder would remain permanently sealed behind a lattice of strict non-disclosure agreements. Second, I would retain a significant block of voting shares, allowing me to exert silent influence over their future investment strategies. When the transaction finalized, I transitioned from a discarded housewife living above an auto parts store into an anonymous entity wielding terrifying financial leverage. I did not purchase a yacht or a penthouse. Vengeance requires discipline. Instead, I quietly funneled a vast portion of my new wealth into a predatory private equity firm headquartered in Atlanta called Vanguard Mezzanine Partners. Vanguard specialized in toxic debt. They targeted distressed companies offering fast, uncollateralized capital at exorbitant interest rates. The contracts were laden with draconian covenants designed to trap the borrower. It was the perfect cage, but I could not simply invite Richard inside. If Vanguard approached his logistics firm directly, his paranoia would flare. He needed to believe the discovery was his own brilliant maneuver. He needed to hunt for the poison himself. I hired an independent financial consultant, an impeccably dressed proxy, who owed me a favor from my days of managing Richard's early ledgers. I instructed this consultant to attend a specific industry luncheon in Birmingham, knowing Richard's chief financial officer, Gregory, would be hovering near the open bar. Gregory was a nervous man, prone to panic when the balance sheets failed to align. My proxy casually mentioned Vanguard Mezzanine Partners during a conversation about alternative corporate funding, praising their rapid approval process and their appetite for logistics portfolios. Gregory took the bait with the eagerness of a starving man. He returned to Mobile and pitched Vanguard to Richard as a hidden gold mine. He presented the equity firm as a rare opportunity to secure a substantial line of credit without enduring the agonizing scrutiny of a traditional bank audit. Richard, exhausted by Valerie's relentless complaints about the halted carriage house renovations and desperate to project unwavering dominance, approved the overture. A week later, Richard drove his luxury sedan 3 hours east, crossing the state line, into Georgia. He parked beneath the towering glass and steel monolith that housed Vanguard Mezzanine Partners. He took the elevator to the 50th floor, stepping into a reception area paneled in dark walnut and smoked glass. He was greeted by a team of senior partners men, wearing tailored suits, who smiled like hungry wolves. I was not in the room. I monitored the proceedings from my office in Birmingham, reviewing the real-time audio transcripts transmitted by the lead negotiator. The loan Vanguard offered was a masterpiece of financial peril. It provided a sweeping $3 million influx of cash. However, the interest rate was crippling. Furthermore, the legal framework included a strict acceleration clause. If Richard missed a single target metric or failed to remit a payment on time, the entire principal balance would become immediately due. To secure such a perilous arrangement, Vanguard demanded tangible collateral. They required a primary lien on his corporate fleet and a secondary lien on his most valuable personal asset, the historic 19th century home in Mobile. Richard hesitated. The transcripts captured a long, heavy silence in the Atlanta boardroom. He understood the risk. Pledging the residential deed meant gambling the very sanctuary he had stolen from me. But the alternative was returning to Valerie empty-handed, facing her cold resentment, and admitting his empire was running on fumes. His pride was a fatal flaw. He convinced himself the Aegis software would generate enough future profit to outpace the crushing interest rates. He believed he was outsmarting the system. The audio feed picked up the distinct, sharp scratching of his gold fountain pen gliding across the thick, textured paper. He signed his name on the final line, sealing his fate. He traded the foundation of his legacy for a temporary illusion of prosperity. He walked out of that glass tower feeling victorious, a man who had successfully navigated a corporate storm. He had no idea that the storm was just beginning. He did not know the multi-million-dollar tech conglomerate that recently absorbed his software provider was the same entity feeding capital into Vanguard. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that the invisible hand holding his new toxic debt was mine. I sat in my quiet office reviewing the digitized copy of his signature. The fifth layer of conflict had locked into place. I owned his nervous system, and now I held the mortgage to his reality. The preparation phase was officially complete. The time had come to initiate the squeeze. The beauty of a mezzanine loan lies in its unforgiving architecture. Sitting in my quiet office above the dormant auto parts store, I watched the financial trap tighten with surgical precision. I instructed the lead partners at Vanguard in Atlanta to monitor Richard's ledgers without an ounce of leniency. The covenants woven into his contract were not standard boilerplate guidelines. They were microscopic tripwires designed to snap under the slightest pressure. Richard was legally obligated to maintain a specific debt-to-income ratio, calculated not on a forgiving quarterly basis, but every 14 days. Furthermore, the contract mandated a strict minimum cash reserve that had to remain untouched, gathering dust while his operational expenses climbed. Down in Mobile, the atmosphere inside the historic house painted a stark contrast to my sterile command center. Valerie remained blissfully ignorant of the approaching storm. She viewed Richard's recent corporate funding not as a desperate lifeline, but as a validation of her elevated social status. Her appetite for prestige deepened alongside her spending habits. She hired a renowned landscape architect from Charleston to redesign the front gardens, insisting on importing rare European hydrangeas that required a specialized irrigation system. When the exorbitant invoice arrived, Richard paid it directly from his dwindling personal checking account. He dared not deny her requests. His entire identity was now tethered to projecting an aura of invincible success. If he admitted the Vanguard capital was meant for corporate survival rather than luxury, the delicate illusion holding their romance together would shatter. The strain of sustaining two distinct falsehoods began to erode his composure. He was playing the role of a titan in the boardroom and a limitless benefactor in the bedroom. But the logistics sector is inherently vulnerable to unpredictable seasonal rhythms. Late September typically brings a brief, unforgiving lull. It sits awkwardly between the late summer agricultural hauls and the frenetic holiday retail rush. To compound the natural slowdown, a localized tropical depression stalled over the Gulf Coast that month. The unrelenting rain washed out a critical stretch of the interstate highway near Pensacola. Richard's fleet, which relied heavily on that specific eastern corridor, suffered a moderate routing delay. It was a standard industry hiccup, the kind of weather event seasoned operators planned for. In previous years, his robust cash reserves would have absorbed the shock seamlessly. The trucks would have taken longer detours, burned extra diesel, and the balance sheets would have recovered by November. This year, the margin for error was non-existent. The weather delay caused his gross monthly revenue to dip by a fraction of a percent. He missed the Vanguard target metric by an amount so small it would have been a rounding error on his old tax returns. The violation triggered an automatic audit sequence in Atlanta. My proxies informed me the moment the threshold was breached. I gave the signal to proceed without hesitation. On a crisp morning, a bonded courier walked into Richard's corporate headquarters. The heavy envelope placed on his mahogany desk did not contain a polite warning or a request for a meeting. It contained a formal notice of default printed on stiff legal parchment. I imagined him sitting there, locking his office door before breaking the seal. He read the document, his pulse undoubtedly pounding against his stiff collar. The acceleration clause was officially invoked. Vanguard demanded the repayment of the entire $3 million principal, plus significant accrued penalties, within 48 hours. Failure to remit the funds would result in the seizure of all pledged collateral: his routing fleet, his corporate bank accounts, the historic 19th century home I had spent decades restoring. Panic is a powerful catalyst. It strips away dignity and forces desperate action. Richard picked up his phone and began dialing the private numbers of men he had known for decades. He called his country club golf partners. He contacted regional supply chain magnates. He reached out to local banking executives who had stood in the pews at our wedding. He asked for emergency bridge loans, offering generous equity returns, and begging for a temporary bailout to satisfy the Atlanta predators. He did not realize I had already anticipated his escape routes and systematically sealed the exits. Over the past 6 months, Aegis Systems had methodically courted those exact competitors and associates. We offered them preferential licensing tiers and exclusive access to our predictive data modeling. In exchange for the discounted software, our contracts included subtle exclusivity clauses. These stipulations restricted their ability to invest in or acquire distressed competing logistics firms without facing severe technological penalties from Aegis. I had drained the water from his surrounding oasis. Every man Richard called offered a polite, hollow excuse. They cited internal budget constraints or sudden market uncertainties. They wished him well, and then they hung up the phone. The walls of his empire closed in rapidly. By the following evening, his options evaporated. He had fewer than 24 hours remaining to procure $3 million, a sum he could not manifest out of thin air. He left his office early, driving back to the historic district under a bruised twilight sky. He carried the suffocating weight of his impending ruin through the front door. Valerie was in the parlor. She sat on the velvet sofa examining a thick catalog of imported Italian marble for the upcoming carriage house renovations. She looked up and criticized his early arrival, mentioning that the caterers for their upcoming autumn gala needed a secondary deposit by Friday. The request was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The pressure cooker environment detonated. Richard did not offer his usual placating smile. He lashed out, his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. He told her there would be no gala. He yelled that her relentless spending was bleeding him dry. He paced the floor, finally shedding the facade of the untouchable executive, his hands gesturing wildly as he blamed her expensive tastes for his financial suffocation. Valerie stood up, her southern charm evaporating instantly. She fired back, accusing him of incompetence. She reminded him that he promised her a life of luxury when he convinced her to walk away from her own secure arrangements. She called him weak, a stinging insult aimed directly at his fragile ego. The argument spiraled, unearthing every hidden resentment they had harbored since the day they conspired against me. The foundation of their relationship, built entirely on stolen comfort and superficial prestige, cracked wide open under the crushing weight of the financial strain. Richard retreated to his study, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. He poured a glass of bourbon with shaking hands. He stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, searching for a miraculous savior that did not exist. The seventh layer of conflict had reached a fever pitch. He was isolated, drowning in debt, and his chosen partner was turning against him. The hourglass was nearly empty, and the sand was running out fast. 3 o'clock in the morning on a Monday carries a distinct, specific silence. High above the sleeping streets of Atlanta, I sat behind a polished obsidian desk in my corner executive suite. The city skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, framing a grid of amber streetlights and silver corporate towers. I did not feel the familiar pull of fatigue. I drank a glass of iced water, watching a digital countdown timer on my secondary monitor slowly tick down to 0. The 48-hour window Vanguard mezzanine partners provided for the emergency cure payment officially expired. Richard failed to wire the $3 million to the holding account. According to the ironclad terms embedded within the Aegis Systems licensing agreement, an active notice of default with any primary lender constituted immediate financial insolvency. This specific legal status authorized Aegis to protect its proprietary technology by severing all network access without prior warning. Elias and the corporate attorneys had drafted the clause originally to shield our intellectual property from bankrupt entities facing asset liquidation. Tonight, I was utilizing that standard industrial protection to systematically dismantle the man who stole my future. I opened the main administrative dashboard. A glowing map of the southeastern United States filled the center screen. Hundreds of tiny green dots crawled along the digital interstates, representing his active freight loads. These were 18-wheelers hauling refrigerated produce bound for regional grocery chains, heavy automotive parts destined for assembly plants, and palletized retail goods critical for the upcoming holiday season. During the early years of our marriage, I used to memorize the driver manifests to keep his chaotic records organized. I knew the families behind those steering wheels. I knew the exact profit margins of every haul. Now I simply stared at the visual manifestation of his crumbling empire. I bypassed the automated legal protocols and manually selected the Global Access Portal. My finger hovered over the keyboard. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the chilled air of the office fill my lungs. I pressed the Enter key. The visual effect was instantaneous and profound. The green dots on my monitor flickered, turned ash gray, and vanished entirely. Across the region, the Aegis software initiated an immediate system purge. Inside the cabs of commercial trucks navigating dark stretches of rural highway, digital routing displays went blank. GPS coordinates ceased transmitting to the home server. Automated dispatch schedules dissolved into empty error screens. Predictive weather models collapsed into useless static. The digital nervous system governing his expansive fleet evaporated into the ether. His logistics empire ground to a literal halt, leaving his drivers stranded and blind. 250 miles away in Mobile, the night shift dispatch center plunged into unparalleled chaos. The room was typically a sanctuary of quiet efficiency, characterized by the soft hum of ringing phones and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. Without warning, the primary tracking monitors lining the wall shifted from a steady green operation mode to a blinding crimson warning state. Frantic red flashing lights illuminated the panicked faces of the night managers. The main switchboard lit up like a localized lightning storm. Confused, angry drivers called in from remote truck stops and isolated highway shoulders, demanding routing information that no longer existed. The dispatchers typed frantically into dead terminals, unable to offer a single piece of guidance. Richard was asleep on the tufted leather sofa in his home study. He had not returned to the master bedroom after his bitter argument with Valerie. An empty crystal tumbler of bourbon sat on the Persian rug near his dangling hand. His cellular phone vibrated across the mahogany coffee table with a harsh, relentless buzzing sound. He ignored it, rolling over and burying his face in the leather cushion. It rang again. Then a third time, echoing loudly in the quiet house. He rubbed his face. His vision was blurry from the alcohol and the crushing stress of the Vanguard deadline. He answered the call, expecting a final demand from the Atlanta bankers. His chief operations director was on the other end of the line, screaming over a cacophony of ringing landlines and shouting dispatchers. The software was gone. The fleet was blind. Millions of dollars in time-sensitive cargo sat paralyzed on the side of the road, accumulating steep contractual delivery penalties by the minute. Richard dropped the phone. The expensive device hit the rug with a dull thud. He sat up, staring at the dark walls of his study. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. He realized he had lost everything in a single night. The failure of the Aegis system meant he could not generate a single dime of revenue to appease Vanguard. The private equity firm would seize the remaining physical assets by noon. The corporate bank accounts were permanently frozen. The business his father built was dead. The historic home surrounding him was forfeit. As the sun crested the horizon, painting the Alabama sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Richard moved through the silent house like an apparition. He bypassed the parlor where Valerie's imported Italian marble catalogs still lay open on the velvet sofa. He could not face her. He could not form the words to explain that the lavish lifestyle she demanded was built on a foundation of quicksand that had just swallowed them whole. He knew her affection was conditional, tied directly to his net worth. He grabbed his keys and slipped out the back door, avoiding the sweeping veranda where he had handed me the divorce papers 2 years prior. He drove downtown, navigating the waking city streets with hollow, defeated eyes. He parked near a high-end artisanal coffee shop on Dauphin Street, seeking a momentary refuge before the corporate executioners arrived. The morning air was already thick with late summer humidity. Inside the pristine cafe, the barista handed him a black coffee in a white ceramic cup. Richard took the drink and walked to a small table near the front window overlooking the sidewalk. His hands trembled so severely that dark liquid sloshed over the rim, burning his knuckles. He did not feel the heat. His mind was a frantic, looping reel of catastrophic scenarios. He needed to construct a lie. He needed a plausible story to feed Valerie to buy himself a few more days of grace before the local sheriffs arrived with eviction notices. He stared blankly out the window, watching early commuters hurry past the glass storefront. He took a shallow breath, trying to steady his erratic heart rate. He turned his head toward the entrance where a wooden newsstand displayed the morning publications. His gaze drifted over the local newspapers and landed squarely on the glossy national magazines arranged on the top tier. He stopped breathing. The white ceramic cup slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered against the tiled floor, sending hot coffee pooling around his expensive leather shoes. He ignored the mess and the startled looks of the other patrons, because setting up the most devastating shock of his life was an image he could never have anticipated in his darkest nightmares. Richard stood paralyzed in the center of the artisanal coffee shop. The shattered ceramic cup lay forgotten at his feet, dark liquid pooling into the grout lines of the tiled floor. The barista called out a cautious inquiry, asking if he required assistance, but the words failed to penetrate the sudden ringing in his ears. His gaze remained locked on the wooden newsstand near the glass entrance doors. There, on the top tier, illuminated by the harsh morning sunlight filtering through the window, sat the latest edition of Forbes magazine. The cover featured a stark, pristine portrait. It was Adelia. She wore a tailored charcoal suit, her posture radiating an effortless, terrifying authority. The soft, compliant aesthetic she maintained during their 25-year marriage was gone. Her expression held no warmth, only a cool, calculating intelligence staring directly into the camera lens. The bold white text of the headline spanned across the glossy image, "The Supply Chain Queen." The subheadline read, "How Adelia Smith Built a Logistics Empire in the Shadows and Secured a 9-Figure Acquisition." Richard felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold and clammy. His brain short-circuited, unable to reconcile the image before him with the narrative he had constructed. He had spent decades telling his country club associates and his corporate board that his wife was a simple domestic manager. He claimed she lacked the strategic bandwidth to understand the complexities of modern commerce. He justified discarding her for Valerie by insisting he required a sophisticated partner. Yet the woman he tossed into a cheap industrial apartment was currently staring back at him from the premier financial publication in the country, heralded as a titan of industry. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up a copy. The glossy paper felt slick against his sweating palms. He flipped past the advertisements, his eyes scanning the feature article with frantic desperation. The text detailed her quiet brilliance, her precise investments in predictive routing, and her recent sale to a global tech conglomerate. The timeline of her rise aligned perfectly with the timeline of his downfall. A sickening knot formed in the pit of his stomach. She did not merely survive the brutal divorce settlement he orchestrated, she conquered the very sector he considered his exclusive domain. Panic, visceral and unyielding, seized his chest. He checked his luxury wristwatch. He had fewer than 4 hours to produce $3 million for Vanguard mezzanine partners or face total corporate liquidation. The private equity sharks in Atlanta were preparing to strip him of his routing fleet and the historic Mobile estate. His traditional banking contacts had abandoned him. His new partner, Valerie, was alienated and hostile. He was drowning in a sea of toxic debt. Then, a twisted spark of delusional hope ignited in his mind. Adelia possessed capital. The magazine indicated she wielded liquid wealth beyond his wildest projections. In his desperate state, his arrogance mutated into a pathetic form of entitlement. He convinced himself that a quarter-century of marriage surely retained a fraction of residual loyalty. He believed Southern guilt, or perhaps lingering affection, might compel her to throw him a lifeline. He forgot the cruelty of his betrayal, remembering only that she used to balance his ledgers and organize his chaotic life. He assumed he could charm her into submission one final time. He rushed out of the coffee shop, ignoring the spilled drink, and stepped into the suffocating humidity of the Alabama morning. He pulled his phone from his suit pocket. His fingers shook so severely he misdialed her number twice before finally initiating the call. He paced the uneven brick sidewalk, lifting the device to his ear, listening to the hollow electronic rings bridging the distance between his ruin and her triumph. 300 miles away in Atlanta, the atmosphere was a study in profound serenity. My corner executive suite sat 50 stories above the waking city. The morning sun cast long geometric shadows across the polished obsidian desk. I did not feel the frantic urgency plaguing the man on the other end of the line. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, holding a tall crystal glass of iced sweet tea. A solitary bead of condensation slipped down the side of the glass, a quiet echo of the night he handed me the divorce papers on the veranda. My cellular phone rested on the dark mahogany surface, the screen illuminated, displaying Richard's name in stark white letters. The device vibrated, creating a soft, rhythmic hum against the wood. I did not reach for it. I leaned back and watched the incoming call alert pulse. The satisfaction of ignoring his digital plea offered a rare, exquisite vintage of vindication. I let the phone ring until the automated system redirected him. A moment later, a notification icon appeared on the screen, signaling a new voicemail message. I set my glass on a linen coaster and tapped the playback icon, activating the speakerphone. Richard's voice filled the quiet expanse of the penthouse office. He sounded breathless, his vocal cords tight with suppressed terror. He attempted to project a casual, confident tone, but the facade crumbled within the first sentence. "Adelia, it is Richard," the recording began. "I saw the news this morning. The magazine cover. It is incredible. Truly an astonishing accomplishment. I always knew you had a head for numbers." I smiled a cold, measured curve of the lips. When I was 22 years old, I found a catastrophic error in his inaugural tax filing that would have bankrupted his fledgling startup. I spent 3 days correcting the math. He patted my shoulder, took the corrected documents, and told me to leave the heavy lifting to the men in the future. Now he was recording revisions to our shared history. "Listen, I'm calling because we need to speak," his voice continued, the pitch rising with poorly concealed desperation. "I am navigating a complex bind down here, a temporary liquidity crisis. It is a minor hurdle, but my traditional credit lines are tied up in expansion collateral. You are doing so well right now. The article made that abundantly clear. I thought perhaps we could arrange a brief bridge loan. Just a temporary injection of capital to keep the operations fluid. We built a life together, Adelia. I know things ended poorly, but surely we can help each other out in the business arena. Call me back, please." The recording ended with a sharp click. The silence returned to the office, heavier and far more satisfying than before. He used the phrase, "doing so well." He minimized his impending bankruptcy as a temporary crisis. He dared to invoke the life we built together, the same life he systematically dismantled and handed to my former best friend. He still viewed me as a resource to be extracted, a safety net designed exclusively to catch him when he stumbled. He failed to realize that the safety net had transformed into a steel cage. I deleted the voicemail. I owed him 0 explanations and no comfortable closures. The preparation phase was over, and the final execution required a sterile, controlled environment. I opened my secure messaging application and drafted a brief directive to the managing director of Vanguard Mezzanine Partners, the firm I anonymously controlled. I instructed the director to reach out to Richard's corporate litigation attorney in Mobile immediately. The message was to be relayed through official channels, maintaining the illusion of a strict banking procedure. I typed the final sentence with precise, deliberate keystrokes. "Tell his legal counsel the senior partner will grant Mr. Smith a brief audience at 2 o'clock this afternoon." I transmitted the text and locked the screen. Down in Alabama, Richard would receive the communication from his panicked lawyer. He would view the scheduled meeting as a miraculous reprieve. He would assume a faceless Atlanta banker was willing to negotiate terms, offering him a chance to charm his way out of the toxic debt. He would get into his luxury sedan and drive north across the state line, rehearsing his hollow promises and fabricating projected revenue margins. He believed he was embarking on a desperate rescue mission to secure his future. He had no concept that he was merely driving himself directly to the slaughterhouse. The board was set, the pieces were locked into their final positions, and the architect of his demise was patiently waiting at the head of the table. He left Mobile before the coastal humidity had a chance to burn off the dark asphalt. He left Valerie asleep in the master bedroom, her silk eye mask firmly in place, blissfully unaware that the imported marble catalogs resting on the parlor sofa were now artifacts of a dead empire. The drive up Interstate 65 was a grueling exercise in suppressed panic. Every mile marker he passed felt like a nail being driven into his corporate coffin. The engine of his luxury sedan hummed a steady, flawless tune, but inside the leather-appointed cabin, the silence was deafening. He gripped the steering wheel until his joints ached, running through the catastrophic math of his Vanguard Mezzanine Partners loan. The acceleration clause was unforgiving. $3 million plus crippling late penalties due immediately. Vanguard was notorious in the southeastern financial sector. They were apex predators who swam in the distressed debt markets, circling vulnerable logistics firms and extracting their marrow. Richard knew this reputation when he signed the paperwork, but his towering pride had convinced him he could outmaneuver the trap. He pulled into the subterranean parking garage beneath the Atlanta headquarters, the screech of his tires echoing sharply against the concrete pillars. He retrieved his briefcase from the passenger seat, noticing the distinct tremor in his fingers. He stepped into the sleek, mirror-paneled elevator on the ground floor. The doors sealed shut, locking him in a polished chrome cage. As the carriage shot upward toward the executive suites, A subtle electronic chime marked the passing of every 10th floor. Ping, ping, ping. The rhythmic tone synchronized flawlessly with the heavy, terrified thudding of his own pulse. He closed his eyes, fighting a sudden wave of nausea. He rehearsed his pitch under his breath. He would offer the anonymous senior partner an exorbitant equity yield, a fabricated margin of profit, anything to secure a 30-day extension. In the dark of the ascending elevator, a suppressed memory forced its way to the surface. He recalled the sweltering summer they started the business. He had possessed nothing but a leased rig and a Rolodex of reluctant clients. Adelia had been the one to sit across from a skeptical regional bank manager, utilizing her sharp accounting acumen and her flawless Southern composure to secure their inaugural operational line of credit. She had constructed the financial bedrock he had spent the last 2 decades taking for granted. When he replaced her with Valerie, he believed he was upgrading to a model better suited for his lavish summit. He never anticipated that removing the bedrock would cause the entire mountain to collapse. The elevator eased to a halt on the 50th floor. The doors parted to reveal a cavernous reception space, clad in dark slate and minimalist art. There were no smiling assistants to offer him coffee. There were no plush waiting chairs to soothe his frayed nerves. The environment was clinically designed to strip a borrower of their confidence before the negotiations even commenced. A single set of imposing oak doors loomed at the far end of the corridor. Richard adjusted his silk tie, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his temple. He pushed through the heavy wooden barriers and stepped into the inner sanctum. The boardroom was a sprawling expanse of intimidation. The southern wall was constructed entirely of glass, offering a blinding, vertigo-inducing view of the sprawling Georgia Capitol. An elongated conference table, carved from a single slab of dark walnut, stretched across the center of the room. It was surrounded by high-backed leather chairs, all vacant, except for the seat positioned at the very head of the table. The figure occupying the seat of power was framed by the glaring sunlight, rendering them a stark, backlit silhouette. Richard froze on the threshold. His Italian leather shoes felt glued to the thick woven carpet. As his pupils adjusted to the harsh contrast, the features of the solitary occupant sharpened into devastating focus. It was Adelia. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that mirrored the armor she sported on the magazine cover he had seen mere hours ago. Her dark hair was secured in a pristine, unyielding twist. She did not rise to greet him. She did not offer a polite Southern pleasantry. She remained perfectly seated, her hands resting calmly on the polished walnut surface, projecting an aura of impenetrable, icy authority. All the fabricated profit margins, the rehearsed pleas for leniency, the hollow promises of equity yields evaporated from Richard's mind. His vocal cords seized. He stood there, a ruined titan clutching a useless leather briefcase, struggling to comprehend the impossible geometry of his reality. "Adelia," he stammered. The syllables felt jagged and foreign in his dry mouth. "What are you doing here?" He took a single, unsteady step forward. His brain, desperate to protect his fragile ego, began frantically spinning logical fallacies to explain her presence. He assumed she was visiting a mutual connection. He guessed she was utilizing the same predatory financial circles to invest her newly acquired tech fortune. "Did the partners call you?" he asked, his voice pitching upward, thick with a pathetic, scrambling hope. "Did Vanguard bring you in to consult on my logistics portfolio? I saw the Forbes article this morning. I know you have immense resources now. If you are sitting here to vouch for me, to offer a bridge loan, I swear I will make the interest worth your while. I know we had a difficult parting, but business is business. You know my operational capacity better than anyone." He was babbling. He was stringing together desperate rationalizations, offering her hollow flattery, while entirely missing the terrifying truth hovering in the room. Adelia allowed him to unravel. She watched his performance without offering a single syllable of interruption. She let the silence stretch, giving the humiliating echo of his assumptions time to bounce off the glass walls. She observed the sweat staining the collar of his expensive shirt, the visible shaking in his fingers, the absolute destruction of the arrogant man who had once banished her to a decaying apartment by the train tracks. When he finally ceased his frantic pleading, panting softly in the sterile air of the boardroom, Adelia executed her first deliberate movement. She reached toward a solitary object resting to her right on the dark wood. It was a thick, legal-sized envelope. She placed her manicured fingers on the edge of the heavy paper and slid it across the expansive length of the table. The document glided smoothly over the polished walnut, decelerating until it came to a perfect stop mere inches from Richard's hands. It was a standard manila folder, edged with stiff blue backing. The visual parallel was flawless and poetic. It was an exact, terrifying echo of the divorce petition he had unceremoniously dropped onto their antique console table in Mobile exactly 2 years ago. Richard stared down at the folder. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning felt suddenly deafening. The trap had effectively closed around his throat, yet the precise mechanics of his execution remained hidden from his view. He reached out to touch the paper, his knuckles turning white, entirely unaware that lifting the cover would detonate the final, inescapable layer of his ruin. Richard stared at the manila folder resting on the dark walnut table. The stiff blue backing of the legal stationery felt like a physical weight pressing the oxygen out of the sterile boardroom. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning amplified the profound silence stretching between us. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingertips brushing the textured paper. He flipped the cover open. Inside lay the original Vanguard Mezzanine Partners loan agreement. It was the exact document he had signed with his gold fountain pen weeks prior, trading his empire for a temporary illusion of solvency. But resting directly on top of the signature page was a new addendum, a notice of default, formally countersigned by the primary holding entity of Aegis Systems. My name was printed clearly on the executive authorization line. He read the text. Then he read it a second time. The color drained from his face, leaving his complexion the shade of old parchment. His eyes darted from the legal print to my face, attempting to bridge the impossible chasm between the woman he discarded and the corporate executioner sitting across from him. I folded my hands perfectly on the polished wood surface. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the soft, measured cadence of a hostess declining an unreasonable request. "I am not here to gloat about a magazine publication, Richard," I said. "I am here because my firm holds your debt." His jaw slackened. The syllables hung in the chilled air, detonating the fragile boundaries of his reality. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the strain. "You run a software startup. You build routing algorithms. Vanguard is a private equity institution. These are distinct entities." I leaned back in the high leather chair, observing his desperate attempt to apply logic to a game he had already lost. I reminded him of the foundational rule of modern commerce. Capital flows like water, seeking the path of least resistance. When the global conglomerate acquired my technology portfolio, I secured a staggering influx of liquid wealth. I funneled a significant portion of that capital directly into Vanguard, adopting the role of a silent senior partner. Did you truly believe a nameless tech firm manifested out of thin air to solve your exact dispatch failures? I asked, watching the horror bloom in his eyes. Did you honestly think a pristine loan offer materialized at the precise moment Valerie demanded imported marble for her carriage house renovations? You always assumed you were the smartest operator in the room. You never bothered to look into the shadows. He began to shake. The physical manifestation of his ruin seized his shoulders. He pointed a trembling finger at the paperwork. "You set a trap. You engineered the software contract to fail." I shook my head, correcting his flawed assumption. The software performed flawlessly. It salvaged your operational margins and stabilized your delivery routes. Aegis Systems upheld every single clause of our licensing agreement. The failure was entirely your own. You prioritized a lavish lifestyle over basic fiscal responsibility. You signed a toxic mezzanine loan knowing the covenants were unforgiving. Yesterday afternoon, your routing fleet missed a fraction of its quarterly target due to a minor weather delay on the Eastern Corridor. Your revenue dipped. You breached the Vanguard minimum reserve requirement. I paused, letting the cold arithmetic of his demise settle over him. The moment you entered default status with your primary lender, the kill switch embedded in the Aegis software activated, I explained. It is a standard automated security protocol designed to protect proprietary code from insolvent clients. You severed your own network access the second you missed that metric. I simply authorized the final execution. Richard pushed himself up from the chair. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, driven by the pure, frantic adrenaline of a cornered animal. He paced the length of the glass wall, casting erratic shadows across the woven carpet. He turned toward me, his face flushed with a sudden, desperate anger. "This is extortion," he shouted, the sound echoing harshly off the boardroom walls. "It is a blatant conflict of interest. I will call my corporate litigators. I will drag you through the federal courts for predatory lending practices. I will expose this entire shell game to the regulatory commissions. You cannot strip me of my company based on a fraction of a percent." His threats were hollow, echoing the very same arrogance that led him to this precipice. I remained seated, unbothered by his escalating volume. I unclasped my hands and gestured toward the open folder. "You are welcome to initiate litigation, Richard. However, you will encounter the exact same impenetrable legal barrier you utilized 2 years ago." I structured the Vanguard Holdings and the Aegis Trust through an intricate labyrinth of Delaware proxy entities. My attorneys are the finest corporate strategists on the Eastern Seaboard. If you file a suit, the discovery phase alone will span half a decade. I watched his chest heave as he struggled to draw a full breath. I delivered the final, devastating blow. Furthermore, litigation requires capital. You do not possess a single liquid asset. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your routing fleet is paralyzed. You cannot pay your drivers, let alone a team of high-tier defense attorneys. He stopped pacing. He stared at me, the fight draining from his posture, replaced by a hollow, suffocating despair. He realized the terrifying symmetry of the moment. He was trapped in the exact same legal nightmare he had orchestrated on my 55th birthday. He was entirely paralyzed, stripped of his resources, facing an adversary who held all the ammunition. I tapped the open folder. The Vanguard Acceleration Clause is active. I am officially executing the terms of your collateral agreement. I walked him through the precise mechanics of his dismantling, speaking with surgical detachment. I informed him that the logistics firm built by his father now belonged to my holding company. I was absorbing his fleet, acquiring his client contracts, and terminating his position as chief executive officer effective immediately. His corner office overlooking the shipping yards was no longer his domain. And the secondary collateral I added, my tone dropping to a quiet, deadly register, the historic property in the Mobile district. The deed transfers to my trust by the close of business today. Richard fell back into his chair. The impact produced a dull thud. The mention of the house shattered his final remaining defense. It was the sanctuary where Valerie currently slept, the lavish stage where they performed their successful romance for the local society pages. "Adelia, please," he whispered. The anger vanished, replaced by a pathetic, hollow begging. He leaned across the walnut table, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Take the fleet. Take the dispatch centers and the vendor contracts. I will sign the resignation papers right now. But let me keep the house. Let me restructure a private mortgage with you. If I lose the property, Valerie will leave. I will have nothing." I looked at the man I had spent a quarter of a century loving, supporting, and advising. I searched for a flicker of pity within myself, a lingering trace of the compliant Southern wife who used to polish the silver and forgive his indiscretions. There was nothing left but cold, polished steel. He was not grieving the loss of his legacy. He was terrified of facing his new partner without his checkbook. I reminded him of the afternoon he stood in the foyer and told me I had 30 days to vacate the home my grandparents restored. I reminded him of the cheap industrial apartment vibrating with the sound of freight trains. "Your signature is on every page, Richard," I said. "You traded your sanctuary for a temporary illusion. The transaction is final." I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button embedded in the conference table. The speaker crackled with a crisp electronic chime. "Security," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "Please come up to the penthouse boardroom. Escort the former chief executive out of the building. He is no longer authorized on the premises." Richard did not argue. He did not shout or throw the manila folder across the room. He sat frozen in the leather chair, a hollow shell of the titan who had walked into the elevator an hour prior. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing 2 uniformed guards. They flanked his chair, offering polite but firm instructions to stand. He picked up his useless briefcase. He turned and walked toward the exit, his shoulders slumped, his expensive Italian shoes dragging heavily against the carpet. He did not look back. He stepped into the corridor, and the heavy doors sealed shut behind him, plunging the boardroom back into a profound, unbroken silence. The corporate execution was complete. I turned my chair toward the glass wall, watching the Atlanta traffic flow through the concrete arteries far below. I took a slow sip of my sweet tea. I had successfully reclaimed my empire. Now the resulting shockwave would travel 300 miles south, directly into the parlor where Valerie sat reviewing her imported marble catalogs, blissfully unaware that her foundation had just turned to dust. The drive down Interstate 65 felt akin to a funeral procession designed for a solitary mourner. Richard navigated the darkening stretches of highway with a numb, hollow detachment. He bypassed the vibrant city centers, staring blankly at the unending white lines blurring past his windshield. He arrived in the historic district just as the wrought iron street lamps flickered to life, casting long, stretching shadows across the manicured lawns of his neighbors. He pulled his luxury sedan into the circular driveway of the 19th century estate. The grand fluted columns of the sweeping front porch stood as silent, indifferent witnesses to his impending exile. Inside the foyer, the air smelled of fresh stargazer lilies and imported citrus wax candles. It was the scent of a pristine, opulent life he could no longer afford. Valerie sat in the formal dining room sipping a glass of chilled white burgundy. Swatches of expensive European fabrics covered the sprawling mahogany table, laid out in meticulous arrangements for her ongoing carriage house renovations. She did not bother to look up when his heavy footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. She merely complained about a delayed shipment of emerald silk draperies, her tone laced with a petulant entitlement. Richard stood motionless in the arched doorway. He looked at the woman who had eagerly helped him orchestrate the theft of my past. He lacked the energy to soften the impending blow or construct a comforting lie. He stated the unvarnished facts with a brutal, flat delivery. The Vanguard loan was officially in default. The logistics fleet was seized by creditors. The corporate accounts were permanently locked. And the deed to the property they were currently occupying belonged entirely to his former wife. For a fleeting second, the pristine mask of the dutiful Southern partner remained intact. Valerie blinked twice, her manicured fingers pausing over a square of velvet. Then the terrifying reality settled over her features, pulling the artificial warmth from her eyes and leaving behind a stark, predatory calculation. Richard stepped forward into the dining room, reaching out a trembling hand, seeking a shred of comfort from the woman he had traded his legacy to acquire. He murmured frantic promises that they could start over, rebuild a smaller enterprise, rely on their shared affection to weather the impending financial storm. Valerie stepped backward, letting his hand drop into the empty space between them. The genteel charm evaporated in an instant, exposing the cold, mercenary instinct that had always governed her choices. She did not offer sweet reassurances or pledges of unwavering loyalty. She laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the quiet elegance of the room like shattering glass. She ridiculed his catastrophic failure without an ounce of pity. She reminded him that she sacrificed her own secure social standing to align herself with a supposed titan of industry, not a bankrupt fool who managed to hand his entire empire back to the woman he had discarded. The argument that followed was entirely devoid of passion or heartbreak. It was a sterile, surgical dismantling of their fractured union. Valerie realized the fountain of wealth had run permanently dry, and her loyalty possessed a very strict expiration date. She left him standing alone among the useless fabric swatches, retreating up the grand staircase to assess the salvage value of her remaining designer assets. 2 days passed in a tense, suffocating silence. Richard scrambled with his panicked attorneys over frantic phone calls, fruitlessly searching for a hidden legal loophole that did not exist. Meanwhile, Valerie moved through the corridors like a ghost preparing for departure. She packed her exorbitant luggage, but she was not preparing for a blind retreat into poverty. She was an apex survivor, highly adept at attaching herself to the nearest viable source of power. She recognized the shifting hierarchy of our fractured dynamic. I possess the capital, the leverage, and the ultimate authority. In her distorted reasoning, she believed she could negotiate a separate peace treaty. She thought my wrath was focused solely on Richard, assuming I might appreciate the poetic irony of utilizing his mistress to cement his ultimate downfall. On a humid Wednesday morning, she loaded her luxury sport utility vehicle and merged onto the northbound interstate, charting a direct course toward my Atlanta headquarters. During the 3-hour drive, she rehearsed her performance, refining the precise cadence of her apologies and the strategic deployment of her fabricated tears. She intended to throw Richard to the wolves to save her own skin. The receptionist on the 50th floor alerted me to the unscheduled arrival. I granted Valerie access to the executive suite, curious to observe the final, desperate spasms of her dignity. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Valerie stepped into the expansive, glass-walled room. She wore a tailored black dress, a deliberate sartorial choice engineered to project humility and deep contrition. She approached the long walnut table with hesitant, measured steps, her eyes cast downward in a display of manufactured shame. During our 2 decades of close friendship, I had witnessed her deploy this exact performance a dozen times to extract favors, secure invitations, or evade responsibility. She sat in the leather chair opposite my desk, folding her hands in her lap. She began her pitch, her voice trembling with a carefully practiced vulnerability. She claimed Richard had manipulated her from the very beginning, weaving a complex narrative where she was merely another naive victim of his towering deceit. She insisted she never wanted to push me out of the Mobile estate, blaming the cruel eviction entirely on his ruthless nature. Then came the anticipated performance art. A single, perfectly timed tear slipped down her cheek, leaving a faint dark smudge of running mascara along her sharp cheekbone. She sniffled softly, leaning forward to lower her voice into a conspiratorial whisper. She offered to turn state's witness against the man she slept beside. She promised to hand over hidden personal ledgers, private emails, and detailed accounts of Richard's corporate fraud spanning the last 5 years. She pledged to testify against him in any civil or federal court proceeding, ensuring his permanent, unrecoverable ruin. In exchange, she framed it as a win for both of us, a chance for the wronged women to unite and punish the arrogant man who had deceived them both. I listened to her desperate bartering without interrupting a single syllable. I allowed her to humiliate herself thoroughly, watching her sell out her lover for a piece of historic real estate and a steady paycheck. She finished her elaborate proposal, offering a weak, hopeful smile, waiting for the shared camaraderie of 2 scorned women to seal the unholy pact. I studied her face, noting the stark, authentic desperation hidden beneath the smeared cosmetics and the designer silk. I offered her my warmest, most terrifying Southern smile. It was the same polite expression I used when rejecting an unsuitable charity proposal. I did not speak a single word of validation. Instead, I opened the top drawer of my obsidian desk. I retrieved a single sheet of crisp white paper bearing the official seal of the state of Alabama. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the document and slid it across the smooth wooden surface, guiding it gently until it rested directly beneath her trembling hands. Valerie looked down, her hopeful expression fracturing into sheer, unadulterated panic. The paper was not a settlement agreement. The document cited her as an unauthorized occupant residing in a property wholly owned by the Aegis Systems Executive Trust. She gasped, the sound catching sharply in her throat. The fake tears evaporated, replaced by genuine, wide-eyed horror. I had already dismantled Richard's corporate empire and stripped him of his legacy. Now I possessed the unquestionable legal authority to eradicate her from my territory. I did not need her fabricated testimony to crush my ex-husband. I had already won the war. Her attempt to negotiate from a position of profound weakness was the final insult, and I punished it with swift, unforgiving bureaucracy. She stared at the eviction notice, finally understanding that the gravy train was permanently derailed, and she was standing alone on the tracks with only 24 hours left to run. The 24-hour deadline expired at precisely 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. The mobile air carried a thick, humid stillness typical of late summer. Down the oak-lined avenue of the historic district, a convoy of unfamiliar vehicles disrupted the usual morning quiet. 2 white cruisers belonging to the county sheriff department led the procession. They were followed closely by a sleek black sedan carrying my lead property attorneys. The flashing blue lights reflected off the wrought iron gates of the 19th century estate. I monitored the execution remotely from my desk in Atlanta, relying on real-time phone updates from my legal counsel. Richard had spent the previous night pacing the hardwood floors. He was likely hoping for a miraculous judicial stay that never materialized. The authorities parked on the circular driveway. Their heavy boots crunched against the pristine gravel Valerie had imported from overseas. A deputy stepped up to the porch and knocked on the heavy mahogany door, holding a clipboard bearing the official writ of possession. The final legal mechanism had engaged. Richard opened the door wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of his unyielding reality. The deputies did not offer any sympathy or polite conversation. They provided strict, rigid instructions. The occupants possessed exactly 60 minutes to gather personal effects before the locks were changed and the perimeter secured by private guards. Valerie rushed past him, her face flushed with frantic terror. She dragged designer suitcases and oversized cardboard boxes down the sweeping staircase. Her high heels scraped carelessly against the polished wood, leaving long, visible gouges. The sheer physical exertion of moving her own belongings was a stark departure from the catered luxury she demanded daily. Richard attempted to carry a heavy antique lamp, but his hands shook, causing the brass base to clatter against the front steps. The deputies stood by with crossed arms, ensuring nothing bolted to the property was removed. Richard and Valerie were forced to haul their scattered possessions directly onto the manicured front lawn. They created a haphazard pile of garments, expensive cosmetics, and framed artwork. The barrier separating their private ruin from public consumption dissolved under the harsh morning sun. The disturbance drew an inevitable audience. The historic district operated as a tightly woven social ecosystem. Reputations were the primary currency, and gossip served as the most valuable export. Women who had attended Valerie's lavish garden parties emerged onto their sprawling verandas. Eleanor Vance, the undisputed matriarch of the local church congregation, stood near her property line, clutching a ceramic coffee mug. Eleanor was a widow who spent her decades cultivating influence among the elite circles. 2 years prior, she had whispered toxic pity regarding my sudden departure. Her quiet endorsement had helped Valerie cement her status as the new reigning hostess. Now, the tide of Southern social warfare reversed its current. The neighbors watched the dismantling of Richard's illusion. They observed the desperate scrambling, the discarded boxes resting on the pristine grass, and the undeniable presence of law enforcement. The whispers began traveling across the manicured hedges. Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locked on my former husband as he dropped a cardboard box onto the driveway. "Bless his heart," she murmured. The phrase drifted through the humid air like a quiet verdict. It was the ultimate social execution. The words stripped Richard of his final shred of dignity. The public humiliation fractured whatever fragile alliance remained between the disgraced executive and his chosen partner. Valerie shoved a final leather travel bag into the trunk of her sport utility vehicle. She turned toward Richard, her features twisted into a mask of bitter resentment. He stood near the front bumper, looking at her with hollow, exhausted eyes. He perhaps expected a shared moment of solidarity, a quiet reassurance that they would endure the hardship together. Instead, she unleashed a torrent of sharp, vocal venom. She accused him of stealing her youth. She blamed him for destroying her social standing and dragging her into a pit of financial ruin. The genteel charm she cultivated for decades evaporated into the humid air, exposing the raw, calculating survivor hiding underneath. She slammed the trunk shut, the metallic thud echoing down the quiet street. She climbed into the driver's seat, engaged the engine, and accelerated down the avenue without a single backward glance. She left him standing alone on the pavement, surrounded by a pathetic heap of wrinkled suits and loose paperwork. The woman he traded his legacy to acquire abandoned him the second the bank accounts ran dry. By nightfall, Richard relocated to the only shelter his frozen assets permitted. He signed a month-to-month lease on a cramped one-bedroom apartment situated on the very edge of the industrial sector. The narrative achieved a flawless poetic symmetry. He carried his few remaining boxes up 2 flights of concrete stairs. He unlocked a door that opened into a space smelling of old cooking grease and industrial floor cleaner. The floors were covered in cheap, peeling linoleum that squeaked under his expensive leather shoes. The walls were paper-thin, offering zero insulation against the chaotic noise of the surrounding city. A nearby freight train rattled along the iron tracks, vibrating the single-pane windows and rattling the cheap lighting fixtures. He sat on the edge of a bare mattress, listening to the harsh mechanical sounds filling his new reality. He was trapped in the exact purgatory he had condemned me to endure 24 months earlier. The environment was a sensory echo of my own past suffering, but the context differed significantly. I survived the industrial apartment because my isolation was fueled by a burning strategic focus. I had a clear target and the relentless drive required to build an empire from scratch. Richard possessed no such internal engine. He sat in the dark, recognizing that arrogance is a fatal liability. Quiet dignity serves as an impenetrable shield, but greed always demands a steep, inevitable toll. He had not been defeated by a vindictive rival. He had been suffocated by the inescapable consequences of his own profound ego. He assumed the lowest point of his life had finally arrived, hoping the descent was over. The quiet of his dismal apartment was suddenly interrupted by a sharp knock on his thin, hollow door. He ignored it, assuming it was a noisy neighbor or a wandering tenant. The knocking persisted, growing louder and more rhythmic against the cheap wood. He dragged himself off the mattress and turned the deadbolt, pulling the door slightly ajar. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a young man wearing a cheap suit, holding a thick manila envelope. The courier asked for Richard by name, handing over the package before turning away without another word. Richard closed the door and tore open the seal. His tired eyes scanned the official legal letterhead. It was a formal summons from the Federal Labor Board. His former drivers, those men stranded on the highways when the Aegis network went dark, were initiating a sweeping class action lawsuit for unpaid wages and extreme breach of contract. He read the names listed on the plaintiff docket. These were drivers he had known for a decade, men who trusted his leadership to feed their families. The sudden loss of routing data had ruined their independent contracting scores and spoiled thousands of dollars in perishable freight. They were seeking severe punitive damages. Richard leaned back against the peeling wallpaper, letting the document slide from his fingers. The realization washed over him like ice water. The bankruptcy court would liquidate whatever physical assets remained, but this civil litigation threatened to garnish his future wages for the rest of his natural life. The corporate entity shielding him was gone, leaving him personally liable for the financial wreckage left in the wake of the software shutdown. The battle to save his business was over, but the war to preserve his personal freedom was just beginning. A week passed before I arranged my schedule to return to the Gulf Coast. The administrative transfer of the seized assets required my sustained focus in Atlanta. I needed to ensure the Aegis Holding Trust absorbed the logistics fleet seamlessly, preventing any further disruption to the regional supply chains. Once the paperwork settled into irreversible concrete, I drove south down Interstate 65. I did not require an armored convoy or an entourage of attorneys. I drove my own sedan, navigating the familiar highway with a profound quiet settling over my shoulders. I arrived in the historic district mid-morning. The oak trees offered a dense, cooling shade over the brick avenues. I turned onto my old street, easing the car into the circular driveway. The imported gravel crunched softly under the tires. The property appeared untouched, preserved perfectly in the amber of Southern tradition. The fluted columns rose tall against the clear sky, and the sweeping veranda looked exactly as it did on the evening of my 55th birthday. I stepped out of the vehicle holding a single brass key. The private security detail I contracted had secured the perimeter days ago, leaving the premises empty and waiting. I climbed the front steps, slid the key into the heavy mahogany door, and turned the lock. The mechanism clicked with a satisfying finality. I pushed the door open and crossed the threshold into the foyer. The immediate sensory impact was jarring. The air inside the house felt thick, saturated with the cloying scent of Valerie's signature imported perfume. It was a heavy floral fragrance that clung to the draperies and the antique upholstery, serving as a lingering ghost of her brief, frantic reign. I did not call a cleaning service to eradicate the scent. I possessed a simpler, far more satisfying solution. I walked through the parlor and into the formal dining room, unlatching the heavy brass locks on the floor-to-ceiling windows. I pushed the tall glass panes outward, inviting the humid Alabama breeze to sweep through the corridors. The coastal wind rushed inside, carrying the authentic smell of salt air and blooming magnolias. The draft caught the sheer curtains, lifting them gently. A shaft of morning sunlight pierced the room, illuminating hundreds of tiny dust motes dancing in the cross breeze. I stood in the center of the parlor, watching the physical manifestation of reclaiming my territory. I walked through the halls not with the frantic energy of a conqueror looting a fallen city, but with the measured, deliberate pace of an architect inspecting a restored foundation. I traced my fingers over the wainscoting I had painted decades ago. I stood in the kitchen where I used to balance the early ledgers on a folding table. The house was no longer a casualty of a bitter divorce. It was a testament to my survival. The emotional resonance of the morning was fulfilling, but my return to Mobile was not driven solely by sentimentality. I had dismantled an empire, and the resulting debris threatened the livelihoods of hundreds of innocent families. The true measure of power is not merely the capacity to destroy an adversary, but the ability to reconstruct the collateral damage. The following morning, I drove to the industrial sector, pulling into the corporate headquarters of the logistics firm. The building was a sprawling complex of brick and tinted glass overlooking the shipping yards. The atmosphere inside the lobby was thick with palpable anxiety. The employees were operating under a cloud of deep uncertainty, terrified of the anonymous corporate entity that had suddenly seized their paychecks. I did not announce my arrival to the reception desk. I walked directly into the executive elevator and rode it to the top floor. I bypassed the stunned administrative assistants and stepped into the corner office Richard had occupied for 20 years. The space remained exactly as he left it, down to the shattered remains of a glass paperweight resting near the baseboard. I sat behind the expansive mahogany desk. I instructed the lead secretary to summon the remaining executive management team immediately. Within 10 minutes, 5 men filed into the room. These were the senior vice presidents and operational directors Richard had handpicked. They were men who had thrived in his toxic culture, prioritizing aggressive expansion over operational stability, and who had gleefully ostracized me when the divorce was finalized. They stood before the desk, their expressions a mixture of confusion and sudden, terrifying recognition. They expected an emissary from the Atlanta private equity firm. They did not expect the discarded wife sitting in the seat of supreme authority. I did not offer them seats or polite introductions. I opened a thick binder containing the unvarnished internal audit my team had compiled over the past week. I read their dismal operational metrics aloud. I detailed their reckless spending, their failure to modernize the routing infrastructure, and their complicity in hiding the company's insolvency from the lower-level employees. They attempted to stammer excuses, shifting the blame entirely onto Richard's erratic leadership. I cut them off with a raised hand. I informed them that Aegis Systems operated under a strict protocol of maximum efficiency. I handed each man a prepared severance package. The terms were brutally minimal, adhering strictly to the bare legal requirements. I fired the entire toxic management tier in less than 15 minutes. I watched them clear their desks and exit the building, systematically purging the rot from the corporate structure. My next directive was aimed at the dispatch floor. I walked down to the nerve center of the operation. The room was chaotic, filled with ringing phones and nervous chatter. I stood at the front of the room and asked for their attention. The noise died down instantly as the dispatchers recognized me. Many of them had worked there for a decade, remembering the days when I organized the company holiday parties and knew their spouses by name. I spoke with a clear, resonant voice. I addressed the terror they felt regarding the Vanguard foreclosure. I assured them the holding trust was dissolving the predatory debt immediately. I announced a comprehensive restructuring plan. I was reinstating the Aegis routing software, restoring full GPS and dispatch capabilities to the fleet within the hour. Furthermore, I authorized an immediate hazard bonus for every driver stranded during the network shutdown, drawing the funds directly from the liquidated assets of the former executive board. The tension in the room snapped. A collective sigh of relief washed over the dispatch floor, followed by genuine, spontaneous applause. I did not bask in the adoration. I returned to the corner office and began the grueling work of untangling the financial knots Richard had tied. I spent the next 12 hours renegotiating vendor contracts, stabilizing the fuel supply lines, and establishing a new, transparent accounting protocol. I proved in a single day what Richard had spent decades trying to suppress. I was a superior leader. I possessed a sharper business acumen and a profound understanding of the human capital required to sustain a logistics network. My ultimate objective was never pure, unadulterated vengeance. Destruction is a temporary, chaotic thrill. My goal was enduring independence and absolute structural stability. I excised the cancer from the company and preserved the healthy tissue, ensuring the enterprise would thrive under competent, ethical command. As the sun set over the Mobile shipping yards, casting long shadows across the rows of idling freight trucks, I locked the corner office. The transition was complete. The company was secure. The house was mine. The conflict was finally resolved, leaving only the quiet aftermath to navigate. The transition from late August into September on the Gulf Coast rarely brings a drop in temperature. Instead, the air thickens, adopting a rich, heavy quality that holds the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine close to the ground. I sat on the deep wraparound porch of the restored estate, letting the rhythm of a woven wicker rocking chair guide my thoughts. A crystal glass of iced sweet tea rested in my right hand. I watched a solitary bead of condensation form near the rim, tracing a slow, erratic path downward until it soaked into the fabric coaster resting on the side table. The visual echo of my 55th birthday was profound, yet the context had shifted entirely. 2 years ago, that falling drop of water mirrored the sudden collapse of my marriage. Tonight, it simply meant the humidity was high. Dusk settled over the neighborhood. The ancient oak trees cast long velvet shadows across the manicured lawns. Deep within the thick magnolia branches, fireflies began their evening performance, sparking brief flashes of gold against the encroaching twilight. The chorus of cicadas rose and fell in a steady, hypnotic wave. I took a slow breath, letting the peaceful isolation fill the spaces where panic and betrayal once lived. People often mistake a Southern woman's silence for submission. They assume that because we do not raise our voices, we do not know how to fight. Society conditions women, particularly those of us who have crossed the threshold of middle age, to accept discard gracefully. When a husband of a quarter century walks away, taking the finances and the foundation, the expectation is predictable. We are supposed to weep. We are supposed to negotiate for scraps, rely on the pity of our social circles, and fade into a quiet, irrelevant twilight. Richard banked his entire strategy on that cultural assumption. He believed my polite smile was a symptom of an empty mind. He mistook my practiced restraint for profound weakness. But restraint is not surrender. Restraint is the conservation of energy. If you are listening to this right now, perhaps sitting in your own car or lying awake in a quiet room, you know exactly what that invisible weight feels like. You understand the suffocating pressure of being underestimated by the very people you helped elevate. You have felt the sting of betrayal from a partner who traded your loyalty for a fleeting illusion, and a friend who smiled in your face while plotting your ruin. I want you to hear me clearly. Your anger is justified. Your grief is a valid, necessary season. But you must never let the grief consume your strategic focus. I spent 24 months living in a sterile, cramped space situated above an industrial train route. The peeling linoleum floors squeaked beneath my shoes, providing a constant, jarring reminder of the elegant hardwood I had lost. I ate cold takeout food, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of computer monitors. My joints ached from the lack of sleep, and the isolation was a heavy physical cloak resting on my shoulders. There were nights when the sheer exhaustion threatened to break my resolve. There were moments when the urge to call Richard, to scream into the telephone and demand an explanation for his cruelty, tasted like copper in my mouth. I swallowed that urge every single time. Screaming offers a temporary chaotic release, but it surrenders your leverage. When you lash out, you reveal your emotional coordinates to the enemy. You show them exactly where you are hurting, giving them the precise data they need to build higher walls. I chose the shadows instead. I chose the relentless, unglamorous grind of dissecting his algorithms, negotiating with cynical developers, and mapping out a financial labyrinth so complex he could never find the exit. The suffering was not a grave, it was a forge. I let the heat of his betrayal burn away my naive dependencies, leaving behind a sharp, unyielding blade of competence. The satisfaction I felt during that final boardroom encounter in Atlanta was not rooted in petty vindictiveness. When I slid the default notice across the polished walnut table, I did not experience a rush of hysterical triumph. I felt the profound settling of a cosmic scale. Richard sat in that leather chair, his tailored suit unable to conceal the total evaporation of his arrogance. He realized the depth of his miscalculation. He understood that the woman he threw away had evolved into the architect of his demise. He begged for leniency, utilizing the same manipulative charm he had weaponized for decades. I offered him the exact measure of mercy he granted me: nothing. The resulting fallout was simply the natural consequence of his greed. I did not force Valerie to abandon him on the driveway. Her departure was the inevitable result of a romance built entirely on stolen capital. I did not compel the Federal Labor Board to pursue him for extreme contract violations. That litigation was born from his own negligent leadership. I merely removed the financial shield he relied upon, allowing the brutal physics of the business world to hold him accountable. He traded a loyal partner for a superficial prize, and he ended up standing alone in a decaying apartment, drowning in a sea of toxic liabilities. True vindication does not require a raised voice. The most devastating response to profound disrespect is never a public argument or a desperate plea for closure. The ultimate vengeance is monumental, undeniable success, constructed quietly out of sight. It is the steady accumulation of skill, capital, and autonomy. When you rebuild your foundation so high that their initial betrayal looks like a minor pebble far below your feet, you have won the war. I took a slow sip of the iced tea, savoring the bitter sweetness against my tongue. The night air was warm and deeply comforting. Down the street, the faint sound of a dog barking drifted through the neighborhood, followed by the quiet rustle of the wind moving through the Spanish moss. The historic property was quiet, devoid of Valerie's imported perfumes and Richard's hollow posturing. It was a sanctuary restored, fortified by the undeniable strength of the woman who held the deed. If you are currently navigating the dark corridors of a shattered life, keep walking. Do not let the arrogance of those who harmed you dictate your final chapter. Gather your resources. Study the terrain. Let them believe they have won. Let them celebrate their temporary victories in the sunlight while you build your empire in the dark. I leaned back in the wicker rocking chair, listening to the rhythmic creak of the wood against the painted porch floor. The stars emerged above the Mobile skyline, bright and unblinking. A profound peace settled over the veranda, wrapping around me like a protective shield. I was 57 years old. I commanded a vast corporate portfolio, governed a loyal workforce, and owned the ground beneath my feet. I smiled into the warm southern night, a quiet, solitary expression of total liberation. I was untouchable.
There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a house when the children have finally gone to sleep. It is in this profound, heavy stillness that the true weight of parenting makes itself known. We sit in the dim light of the living room, or perhaps out on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the fireflies flicker in the humid night air, and we ask ourselves the questions that haunt every mother and father. Are we truly preparing them for the world? Are we giving them the armor they need, or just the comfortable illusions we wish were true? When I reflect on the story of Adelia Smith, a woman who endured the ultimate betrayal within the traditional structures of a Southern marriage, only to quietly build an empire in the shadows, I do not just see a tale of brilliant, calculated revenge. I see a profound, modern parable about how we must raise our children in today's complex American culture. Adelia's quiet resistance and resounding success offer a blueprint for family responsibility, long-term guidance, and the deep, often misunderstood value of emotional awareness. In our culture, particularly in the traditional South, we teach our children the value of politeness. We teach them to say please and thank you, to respect their elders, and to keep their composure in public. But there is a dangerous line where composure can be mistaken for submission. We often fail to teach our children the difference between the two. When Adelia was handed divorce papers on her 55th birthday and watched her life's foundation crumble, she did not scream. She did not break plates or beg for mercy. She absorbed the shock. This is the first and perhaps most vital lesson we must pass down. Emotional intelligence is the ultimate shield. We must teach our children that when faced with profound unfairness, reacting impulsively is a surrender of power. We must educate them that dignity is a permanent asset, while arrogance is a heavy, blinding burden. When our children come home bruised by the cruelties of the world, a betrayal by a friend, an unfair grade, a broken promise, our instinct is to teach them to fight back loudly. But Adelia teaches us to show them how to sit still, to process the pain with self-respect, and to use reason to analyze the board before making a move. We must teach them that silence is not a white flag. It is the quiet before the storm. It is the space where strategy is born. But emotional resilience alone is not enough to survive the modern world. It must be paired with tangible, irrefutable capability. For generations, we have told our children that hard work and a good heart are the keys to a successful life. We tell them to be honest and fair, and the world will reward them. Yet Richard's betrayal of Adelia began with a legal trap involving shared property, a trap she fell into because of blind trust. Love and traditional family structures are beautiful, essential things, but they must go hand in hand with financial independence and legal awareness. We are doing our children, especially our daughters, a massive disservice if we do not teach them how to read a contract, how to understand a bank statement, and how to protect their own autonomy. We must encourage them to learn the mechanics of the world, finance, law, and technology. Adelia's victory wasn't a stroke of luck. It was the result of mastering the core knowledge that her arrogant husband had disregarded. She understood the payroll, the routing algorithms, and the complex financial terms better than the man whose name was on the building. We must teach our kids to master the bottleneck, to find the gaps in the system, and to become the undeniable owners of the toll booth that the world must pass through. Blind trust without knowledge is a recipe for tragedy. Informed trust is the foundation of a lasting legacy. Stories like Adelia's serve as vital mirrors for our own lives, reflecting the harsh realities and the beautiful triumphs of the human spirit. If these reflections on resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of endurance resonate with you, and if you are seeking more narratives that challenge the way we live and raise our families, I invite you to join our community. Please take a moment to subscribe and follow our channel, Sophia Told Stories. We are dedicated to exploring the deep, messy, and triumphant truths of life, and we would be honored to have you walk this journey with us. Ultimately, the most resonant lesson from Adelia's journey is about the ethics of power. What do we hope our children will do when they finally achieve success? When they have the leverage, the money, and the authority, how will they treat the people beneath them? The starkest contrast between Adelia and Richard was not just in their intellect, but in their humanity. When Richard had power, he used it to discard his loyal wife and fund a lavish, superficial lifestyle with Valerie. When Adelia seized ultimate power, holding the fate of Richard's entire company in her hands, she did not burn the building to the ground. She walked into the headquarters, fired the toxic management, and immediately restructured the firm to save the jobs of the innocent employees, the dispatchers and drivers whose livelihoods hung in the balance. We must nurture this exact brand of compassion and business ethics in our children. We must teach them that the true goal of success is never just vengeance or personal luxury. The purpose of acquiring power is to build stability, to enforce fairness, and to protect the community around you. True strength is found in the ability to recover from devastation and use your newly built empire to shield others from the rain. As the sun sets and the porch lights flicker on across our neighborhoods, we are left with the quiet, lingering echoes of the choices we make every day. We tuck our children into bed, we pack their lunches, we dry their tears, and we hope, we desperately hope, that the lessons we impart will take root. We teach them to live discreetly but think big, knowing that the greatest success is often built quietly in the dark. But as we sit in the stillness, holding our own glass of sweet tea, a haunting question remains suspended in the humid night air. When the storms inevitably come for them, when the world tests their dignity, their knowledge, and their compassion, who will they become in the shadows? Will they break under the weight of the betrayal? Or will they learn to build an untouchable life? We can only give them the tools. The empire they choose to build, or the ruins they leave behind, will ultimately be a reflection they alone must face in the mirror.